Hello everyone, welcome to this session on income support, which is going to be focused on the unemployment benefit system. My name's Matt Nolan, and I've worked on these types of issues for a fair few years now and did my studies on them, and I think it's exciting that as part of this course we're looking at the income support system. Now, it's not a policy that's always as exciting, it's not nearly as tangible to a lot of people as something around building roads or building some type of infrastructure or thinking about the healthcare system or the education system. But it does affect a lot of people's lives, and it was the reason why I came into economics, was to understand how this worked and what sort of trade-offs existed. Now, when we look at this type of issue, we're going to go through three key areas. We're going to define what a general income support system is. We're then going to focus on the unemployment benefit system itself, and then we'll turn around and talk about this idea of optimal benefits. That's where we start using our economic frameworks in order to define things about what the benefit level should be, how it should be structured, and we will go more into that in our second section as well. So let's get this underway. So what is an income support system? It feels like income support is something that's just naturally there. I know that when I was young, I saw the benefit system just being part of the fabric of society, part of what existed. And when there were big changes with the mother of all budgets in the early 90s, that seemed like quite a stark change. What I didn't realize, but I realized as I studied these issues, is these types of stark changes and settings are very common and have occurred through time, facing different social pressure. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, and even in the earlier stages of it, you didn't have the idea of a nation state that would be providing income support. Instead, you would have support networks around you in the case that you came into a situation where you had insufficient income. Now, before saying all this, why do we need income? We need income in order to consume, in order to meet our needs, in order to meet our wants and desires. The very thing that we've come in trying to understand with economics. Now, when someone doesn't have sufficient income, they can fall into substantial hardship. And prior to the Industrial Revolution, you would have a family unit that would insure you in some way, protect you against income loss. You would have a church where people would share their income or support each other. There would be charities. And then once you started getting quite large social disruption with the Industrial Revolution and a lot of people moving to cities, you had things like the poor laws introduced in the United Kingdom. Now, without some set income standard, this could mean that over time, the amount of support people received would vary a lot and was contingent on how the people with a lot of income felt at points in time. And views about poverty at that stage were that it's a moral vice, that you were doing something wrong to be poor. And there's a whole interesting set of topics there, but that's not the focus of why we're here. What we want to think about is how the modern income support system evolved. So in the late 19th century, you had a boom in infrastructural spending. A lot of railways were built around the world, but then that led to a crash. And one of the largest financial crises that we'd seen to that point. Following that was what was called the Long Depression over the 1890s. That Long Depression lasted for 10 years. During that time, several things were noted. Firstly, because growth seemed relatively weak, there was a situation where people weren't able to find work and you started seeing people that were unemployed. A lot of those people had specific types of characteristics. They were older people. They had skills that didn't necessarily suit the way the economy was moving. So that created pressure to start giving income support to people who were older and to provide income support to people who found themselves out of work where you felt like you knew that there was a good reason why they were out of work. So early examples of this come from places like Germany. So a lot of people call Otto von Bismarck the father of the welfare state, because in the Prussian Empire, he had set up a lot of these pensions and payments towards young men to make sure they could eat. And his motive for doing so was social cohesion, an idea that the state was an extension of the family and the church and the such, and also a view that if people were able to have sufficient material needs met, they would be in good fighting shape if there was ever a war. So there were a series of motives driving why he thought it was a good idea. And it wasn't necessarily a concern for the poor itself. It was a view that within the structure of how society was, the government was an extension of the family, and so it could fit in that way. And furthermore, a healthy society where a certain minimum income was met would lead to better outcomes for some society as a whole. Now, one thing you'll notice there is that might seem a bit strange when you hear that it's left-wing parties that are often very supportive of the benefit system, because Otto von Bismarck was quite right-wing, quite nationalistic. But there's always some motivation for why we might have certain payments and certain redistribution that can come from either side. It's not always clearly left and right. Now, as we go past this long depression, which at the time was called the Great Depression, you had World War I, and you had a whole series of different crises going on, but there was no big run-up in unemployment in the same way there was during the Long Depression. During that period, there was sort of a stagnation in the welfare state, but certain types of things came in. So in New Zealand, you had the old age pension come in, but you also had this thing called a miner's benefit. So miners could get a very clear health condition that meant they couldn't work anymore. So it was seen as a situation where, since you cannot work anymore, you should receive a payment. And the same motivation was given for old age pensions. During that inter-depression years, the focus was very much on people who cannot work, not the situation where someone decides not to work. Once we hit the depression, there was a recognition that that line is very blurry. So there had been talk about having some type of unemployment insurance where someone, if they paid into the insurance part of their income, would receive a payout if they were unemployed. But that fell flat once we came into a depression and there were unemployment rates over 20%. During that time, the Labour government managed to pass what's known as the Social Security Act in 1938, and that led to the foundation of what we see as the welfare state today, with unemployment benefits, support if you are unable to work because you're disabled, and support that went towards families in certain ways. After the Great Depression and after World War II, these sorts of things took the world by storm. So you had Sweden suddenly become a large welfare state when it previously wasn't, and it was on the same grounds that Bismarck had talked about these ideas of having a spread, having the state form part of a family unit in some way. But also, Swedish people were quite individualistic, and this gave them a way of giving individual support without having to rely quite as much on charity or fixed church relationships. So you had a whole different way of thinking about universality there. Australia and New Zealand acted very differently to other countries, where it wasn't income support that was the key lever for determining that people earned what would view as a fair income. Instead, there was a lot more active labour market policies, such as minimum wages, wage boards, and work for the dole type schemes that weren't called that, where people were just given work by the government. Now, these are all fascinating issues, but we are here to solely talk about the history of income support. So with income support, what were the key debates that drove that history, that drove what was happening? There's a question of who is responsible for poverty. Is it the individual? Is it the family around them? Is it their community? Or is it the entire nation? There's a question of, is there a difference in who is deserving of assistance? So when we look at this sort of thing, do we have a situation where someone who doesn't want to work doesn't deserve assistance? Does someone with a disability who has higher costs due to that disability deserve greater assistance than someone who is let off from work but is still able to do other things without facing the costs of the disability? Is it the case that we want to incentivize some type of social behavior, such as people to form families, such as people to turn around and drink more or drink less? And how should we structure our income support in order to ensure that, or should we even do that? Is that encroaching too much on individual responsibility? And then finally, does it allow people to insure when they otherwise can't? Does having a welfare state allow someone to say, I know that in the case of unemployment, I'm going to receive a payment, so I don't need to save as much now. Essentially, my taxes are insuring this for me. Now, we can have very different views about what's right or wrong here. There are things that would have felt or sounded abhorrent to you because you might have a very individualistic view of society. You might have a very statist or social view. None of those are right or wrong. They all depend on certain circumstances and what would call ethical judgments. The goal of economics is to describe trade-offs that exist when we make choices, so that these ethical statements are transparent and we can have a discussion based on the different ethical views we hold. Now, we could disagree with each other in a fiery way about it, but we should have a shared framework and a shared number of empirical estimates that are in the background. And then given that, we might reach very different conclusions due to the ethical statements we make. Doing this work of building a framework and finding data doesn't tell us what's right. In terms of policy, if you're working within government or you're working for some type of agency that advises government, you are looking at giving advice that works on this framework. The minister is the one that's saying, I have been elected in to support these types of ethical judgments, I will take this view on these trade-offs. The minister says that, but it's your advice to say it will have these effects. You're the one that's the expert at doing that, and then that informs their decision making. And if they're a good minister, they'll take that into consideration. And then from there, if it turns out that they're doing something that harms groups they didn't realize they would, they'll change the policy they're going to do in order to meet those ethical judgments. So that's the way we'd structure all of this when we think in a policy sense. So what types of income support can we have? We can have them for a whole range of things as we discussed, but I just want to think about three types of categories: pensions, benefits or assistance, and insurance. If we look at unemployment, an unemployment pension is a payment given to someone due to them being unemployed, but it does not hold mutual obligations. They don't have to do training, they don't have to do some type of searching for work. There'll be means and income testing, which means that you look at how much they have in terms of assets and how much income they're earning even though they're not working. They might have interest income from a bank or dividends from shares. You still take that into account, but there's no mutual obligation. It's a pension. You are unemployed, ergo you get it. You don't have to meet obligations. The types of systems that we have, and a lot of countries have, are unemployment benefits. That includes mutual obligations, which are the idea that you will turn around and you will say, look for work. You will turn around and you will do a training course. If you can't find work and you don't feel like applying for jobs, you will do something so that you're part of that employment system still. Finally is the idea of unemployment insurance, which is where you give contributions as you're earning and then you receive support based on those contributions. It's similar to the unemployment benefit system in terms of receiving a payment, but your payment will depend on what you put in, when the unemployment benefit did not depend in that sort of way. Within all of this, there's a third tier of assistance that takes into account that people have specific needs. This will tend to be targeted, discretionary, so someone has to go in and apply and say that I have a certain circumstance I'm facing, and will often be lump sum in nature, so they just receive a payment. So this could be to get you clothing to go to a job interview. It could be that you have a disability and you require a wheelchair. It could be that you're in a situation where your fridge is broken and that's increasing your costs and stressing you out and making it hard to find work, and as a result, you receive a payment or potentially a loan, depending on how the system works. Cool. So that's an outline of the history of income support, but now we really want to focus on just unemployment. So what is an unemployment payment? An unemployment payment is assistance given based on being unemployed. So what is unemployed? Unemployed is when you're not in work, but you're looking. So it's not the case when you're not in work, but you're actually 12 years old and you're just going to primary school. It's not unemployment when you are currently at university, working away on completing your economics degree. And it's not unemployment when you've gone and you've retired and you don't want to work anymore. Similarly, it's not unemployment when you're a 24-year-old driving around a camper van, enjoying the countryside, not interested in trying to get a job, just having a gap year. None of those are unemployment. You're not employed, but you're not unemployed. Now, given this characteristic, this means that an unemployment benefit is not a guaranteed income. It's not something someone gets for existing. People only receive it when they can show they're unemployed in some way. It could be that they're looking for work. It could be that they're in training that's been given to them in lieu of looking for work. Or it could be the case that they have some sort of health condition such that they can't work. And then there'll be a related set of payments that we wouldn't really call unemployment payments. They're within job seeker support, but they're different in nature. So we're going to put them to the side. When we look at these payments, we will look at a family. So often with tax and with generally how we think about how someone's turning around and doing things and consuming and receiving utility, we'd think about the individual. But the unemployment system is based on this idea of a family. So what do we mean when we say a family? We mean that there is an income unit. There is a series of people who share income amongst each other. They share expenses when they go and consume. They cook together. They live together. When you have that income unit of people that are together, that will define a family. So this is a much broader definition than you'll often hear people say when they're talking about a couple. But often thinking about a couple with children captures the large majority of families we observe and that are often tested. So in this way, you'll often look at family income, and if you are made unemployed and your partner is earning income, that income is counted as income for you in some way. And so your ability to receive an unemployment payment is affected by that. Mutual obligations are the concept of searching for work and training in order to receive the payment. You are expected to try to find a job. And the nature of these mutual obligations can change a lot and have changed a lot in New Zealand over the last 30 to 40 years. Entitlement criteria are another kettle of fish, which just say if you have assets, you don't need the unemployment payment. You need to run down those assets first because assets are your savings, and those savings were there in case of a rainy day. The income test is saying that you're part of some family and that earns income and you get to consume from that income. You get insured, you get protected by that family. Now, if that family's earning enough, you will not receive a benefit. Another important part of the entitlement criteria is how you left your last job. If you were fired or if the business shut down, you can receive the payment fairly quickly, within a week or two. If you resigned or you were fired for misconduct, you could have to wait as long as 13 weeks before you're eligible for a payment and what's called a cool down or a stand down period. Now, this design of unemployment payments involves the idea of anonymity or horizontal equity, where everyone's being treated equally given this view that people share resources within a family. So it's slightly different to things like if you've done a course on tax, where this would imply individual treatment. This implies family level treatment, but you're not differentiating the families on the basis of characteristics of that family. Now, sickness and health are areas where we would treat this differently, and we would say that actually we will pay people different amounts or test them in different ways for this reason, but we'll leave that to the side here as said. We're focusing on people who could work, who are of working age, who have lost their job. The first concept I want to focus on here is what's called the iron triangle of welfare. So there's a lot of iron triangles across all sorts of economic concepts, but this one refers specifically to welfare programs. So the iron triangle says that you have three different goals of a welfare program. One is to alleviate poverty, one is to provide work incentives, another is to limit costs, to keep the fiscal costs low. One way to think about this is if you have a certain amount to spend, then if you could target it really well, you could really alleviate poverty. But when you do that targeting, you get a situation where people that are semi in need receive a lower payment. And because they're receiving a lower payment than someone that's very much in need, they'll know that if they act very much in need by not working at all, they end up not losing that part of the benefit payment. Okay, their benefit payment does not abate. So in some sense, targeting in that way leads to very high tax rates, or what are called effective marginal tax rates, for people who are not in the worst situation, but coming out of the welfare system, starting to get into work. So it limits the incentive to work when you're alleviating poverty that way. However, if you ignored that, then for the same fiscal cost, you couldn't actually give people as much of a payment. You would have to pay them less, and as a result, you wouldn't alleviate poverty by as much. So you see the trade-off that exists there between those two very much comes from the fiscal cost. So there are constantly questions about how can you target those you want to target when you're talking about poverty. Now, when we talk that way, the first thing we clearly want to understand is what do we mean by poverty? What are we saying when we say poverty? So, we know with something like poverty that benefits and their eligibility criteria will mechanically lower poverty in dollar terms. If poverty is defined in terms of the number of dollars people have available in order to consume at a point in time, then we know that paying people more money, giving them more money, will lower poverty. Yes, it could well be the case that if you gave people money, it would lead to prices being driven up. But that drives up prices for everyone while increasing the endowment or the amount of income to people that are lower income. That process will pull them out of that material poverty. So we know in some sense that poverty is determined by the level of the benefit and how willing we are to give it to people. So that bloke before driving his camper van around the country, the fact that we weren't giving him a payment said that his poverty, the fact that his income was low right now, didn't matter to us. We might believe that he is making a choice and he could earn income if he wanted to, and he's decided that this trip is worth sacrificing the income. So we're happy to keep him out. But what happens if he's really discouraged about life? He's actually had a really bad time growing up, and he just does not trust society, doesn't trust anything, and so he's completely disenfranchised. That's someone we might want to have income and to try to bring into the net and make them feel like part of society again. So you see, we start to get trade-offs here, given different views about what's driving what, and the fact that we can't observe all these perfect things. When we make a choice to exclude or include someone, we are making that choice. To help consider this, we can look at this graph here from IRD. So what we have here is the number of people that receive approximately a certain taxable income. Now, when we look at this, we can see a lot of people get a taxable income quite close to zero. A lot of those people are with a family, and as a result, we probably wouldn't view them as being in poverty. But there will be some people, like our friend who was driving their camper van around the country, who are in that space. If we were to take a mechanistic view of poverty, and we did it at the individual level, we would draw in a poverty line like so, and then we would take all of the people who are under the curve, okay, all of the count from the left of this line, and that would tell us the number of people who are in poverty. If we set a minimum benefit that every single person received, in this case about $10,500 a year, we would eradicate poverty in a mechanistic sense. Now, whether that's something we'd want to do reflects against the costs of doing so, and also whether we truly view people as being in poverty there. The fact that some of these people are second earners in wealthy families earning hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, means that we wouldn't really want to count them. The other fact that we have people like our friend driving around in their camper van might lead to some people saying, well, he shouldn't receive it. He could be earning income and has decided not to. He has the opportunity to and has decided not to. Therefore, he's decided whatever he's doing is worth it. Other people would say the idea of giving this person income is just to make them feel part of society. They might be discouraged. They might be traveling around the country in a van because they've had a very hard time. And making sure they can meet their basic material needs is important, even if there's other ways they can get their income right now. So you immediately start getting these debates about specific circumstances. Ultimately, there are infinite number of, well, not infinite, but say 5 million different individual circumstances all around New Zealand. And in that situation, trying to draw a policy that meets every single one in great detail wouldn't be possible. So arbitrary lines need to be drawn, and we need to make certain cases. And ultimately, there's going to be big arguments about what those is. We just want to think about how to measure it and what the trade-offs would be. Now, in that context, we can ask ourselves again, what is poverty? So when we talked about it being mechanistic, we said that that fell down because there might be people that, don't really need it. But what happens if we could correct that? Well, how do we determine that line? Is that line an absolute amount? If someone can buy so many apples, are they not in poverty? Or is it relative? If you earn 50% of what the average person earns, does that put you on the border of poverty? Now, this matters because if we think it's an absolute line, it's just about buying a certain bundle of goods, we would want this amount to never change. We would just want it to adjust for prices. But if it's about what the average person is earning and status within a society, then you'd think about the benefit level differently, and you might make sure that people receive a higher payment as wages tend to rise more quickly than prices, even if they're not right this second. Now, as you can see here, we have all these different age groups with what's called a relative poverty threshold. This shows that relative poverty since the 1990s has been roughly unchanged. If you looked at absolute poverty, then actually people on benefits are now receiving more income than they were there. A lot of other people are receiving much more income than they were, including people working part-time. So absolute poverty has declined, while the relative poverty figure hasn't. If we look back to the 1980s, well, the relative benefit level then was about the same as it is now, but was much higher relative to income right now, but it's much higher than it had been for a lot of that period. And as a result, it makes sense that relative line was lower because having those higher benefit numbers did lower that relative line. Another way to think about it is poverty isn't just about what you can materially buy, but your ability to build social capital. If we gave everyone a whole lot of money and made it that people didn't earn different amounts, there would still be people in deprivation, people suffering from what we're concerned about when we talk about poverty. So how far can mechanistically reducing poverty actually change these things? And ultimately, is there some sort of trade-off? If we turned around and we were to solve poverty by giving people money, would it lead to a situation where down the line people end up in a worse circumstance? If people start relying on benefit payments, do their children then rely on benefit payments as well, creating a vicious cycle where people separate themselves based on whether they're working for income or they're receiving it from the state? These questions are really, really hard, and often people on both sides will try to make them sound easy. Now, what do we mean when we talk about incentives to work? Well, benefit abatement is the idea that for each additional hour you turn around and work and earn money, some of your benefit will be taken away. Up on the screen, you'll see that in New Zealand, there is a benefit abatement threshold that kicks in at 30%, another one at 70%. These thresholds then say that if you earn an extra dollar over that threshold, 30% of that will be taken away from the benefit, so 30 cents. And then the second threshold, 70%, so 70 cents. This is on top of the tax you're already paying, meaning that if you turn around and work an extra hour, you'll get virtually no money for it. Now, when we think about what incentive this would create for someone to work, we have to remember that people are thinking about the value of their leisure at the same time. So we know this works in two ways. If you increase the benefit level, then that higher level of income will mean that people will turn around and consume normal goods, such as leisure. And as a result, the combination of the higher abatement rate, which means that you're getting less extra income as you work because it's been taken away from your benefit, and the existence of the higher benefit rate itself increasing your income, should turn around and reduce your labor supply. This is what we mean, substitution and income effects, when we talk about the work incentives associated with benefits. Now, these combination of income and substitution effects are something that you've already been thinking about earlier in this class, when there was a discussion of labour supply. So when the wage rises for someone, they'll only work more if the substitution effect is greater than the income effect. That situation with abatement means that they receive less of a wage for working that extra hour, and as a result, you have this negative substitution effect. Furthermore, the idea that we have a benefit being paid comes up as an increase here in our budget constraint. That's irrespective of the number of hours we earn, we can consume just as much leisure as before. That, because leisure is a normal good, also leads to a reduction in hours of work. Now, these are the curves we like to look at, but I would like to just work through them. I just need to switch my screen to show you how these all draw up, and I'll show you that there. Hello all, apologies if the sound isn't quite as good because I am using a pad for this part. But I do really enjoy actually drawing up these graphs in person rather than doing them on a computer. So remember our good friend, the axes of wage and leisure time, where your total time is equal to your hours of work. Let's make that H plus your hours of leisure. Therefore, we can think of leisure as being equal to our total time minus our hours of work, which means there's a negative relationship between them. That's all well and good. Now the amount of income we get, which we've got over here as W, is equal to the wage times the hours of work. So all well and good. What we want to think about, though, is how our different budget constraints look. Imagine we have no unemployment benefit and we have some wage. So every time we work 1 hour, we get paid that wage, and our total amount of income goes up by that amount. So the slope here is our wage. Now imagine a situation where we get paid an unemployment benefit, but we also get charged some sort of tax rate when we turn around and work. Well, what's happening in this situation is that if we're not working at all, we get a chunk of money, and then that additional amount of money as we go along, as we work, is less and less. So we're getting less than the wage for each hour we're working. This is how our benefit abatement works. The fact that this line has become flatter is our substitution effect we were discussing. And the fact that we have this up bit and that this budget constraint is all above the prior one is our income effect. We now have more income in this specific example. Now let's throw in an indifference curve from before. We can see that we were incentivized to work. And we were working this number of hours to get this much income. Now in this instance, we know that we will choose a higher indifference curve, so it must be at some point between these two. Could be anywhere. It could be a point that's over here that involves us taking more leisure, or a point that's over here that involves us actually working more than we were before. Either could happen. Both of them are completely consistent with rationality. But what we can see is because this curve has gotten flatter, and because of everything going on with it, there's a very large range where we're working fewer hours. This captures some of our intuition about what's going on with the income and substitution effects. In this way, all we're really saying when we turn around and do this is the following. We know that leisure is a normal good, and we know that wage income is a normal good as well. So in terms of the income effects, we wouldn't expect any reduction. So if the curve had moved out in a parallel manner, we would expect to essentially be turning around and taking as much leisure as we were before, maybe more. Okay. Because of that, we can immediately say, well, We know we have a situation where people would work less because of this income effect that's happened. And then the substitution effect has occurred as well. And this is making turning around and doing labor income even more expensive. So we've got a situation where we very much would expect to see a movement towards less labor. Now, that's enough of us drawing up this graph. Cool. Now we are back to the main set of slides. And given we know about these labor supply effects and we know that things can be quite interesting with how we think about them, we want to add a bit more detail. What we described involved people sitting there and being quite static. They were looking at leisure and they were looking at some value of consumption. Now they may well be thinking about saving some of that income. If they're thinking about saving or borrowing, they're thinking about consumption in the future as well. So I'm using static here, even though we are thinking about consumption in the future. Ultimately, there is some wage and there's some leisure, and people are responding to that. Now, there might be a pathway of wages and a pathway of consumption that people expect, but those things aren't exogenous, they're not just given. Someone's decision to work now can affect what wage they'll receive in the future. As a result, these labor supply decisions can be more dynamic. You know that if you're in a job, you can build up human capital, and you might be less responsive to what's going on. You might be less likely to leave a job because the abatement rate is high, and so your effective marginal tax rate is high, and you're not getting much extra income right now, because you believe if you stay in that job, you'll be able to get a higher paying job later. You will keep doing that part-time job at the warehouse, not just because you enjoy sitting there on the checkouts, working late on Christmas Eve, but because you know that you'll be able to build up a reputation as a good worker, build up relationships with people you enjoy, and potentially move into a manager job later on down the line, as I know the warehouse does like to help people move up into management. So in that environment, work incentives can get a lot more complicated, and we're going to want to think about that a bit more later in this session. So we've got the poverty and we've got the work incentives, and we can see that this idea of increasing the benefit level to reduce poverty can lead to a substitution effect due to abatement and an income effect due to the fact that leisure is a normal good that lead to reduced labor supply choices. Now, what are we talking about when we're talking about limiting fiscal costs? How does that come into it? We're essentially saying that there is a fiscal constraint. We can only spend so much, and we're trying to decide what the structure of it is. To truly alleviate poverty as much as we can, we will want to do things rather than just give a flat rate payment to everyone. But because we do that, we have abatement. Because we do that, some people will miss out. And this process is called targeting. So targeting involves the abatement that we've talked about earlier, where once you get to a certain amount of income, if you earn an extra dollar, part of your benefit starts being taken away. Unless we're going to pay everyone in the economy an amount of money, there will be a period of income where abatement has to occur. Okay? If we only started abating benefits at $100,000 a year, then someone earning their $100,001th dollar would start seeing the benefit decline. If they got the entire benefit taken off them, then they would have a massive effective marginal tax rate, because they would go from earning $100,000 gross plus the benefit to $100,001 when the benefit is giving them $20-something thousand a year. That would be a huge drop for just earning $1 more. Given that we've discussed abatement already, and given we understand this concept well, what other criteria do we have here? Well, firstly, we have the idea of restricting eligibility criteria. So the eligibility criteria are things such as, what is your family earning? How many assets do you have? In New Zealand, eligibility criteria are very strict. There's a lot of tracking about whether you have a partner and tracking of their income. There is a lot of strict asset testing, such that if you only have a small number of assets, you're still expected to run them down before you'll receive a payment. I'm currently living in Australia, and I've been quite shocked, not in a positive or negative way, but just in a way that I've been learning, at how much more generous their eligibility criteria are for unemployed people, how much more you can hold in terms of assets, how much more freedom you have about thinking about partner income. And this way, they've been less restrictive, and they do pay a lot more when it comes to determining eligibility. Now, part of this also is the idea of, are you a student or not? In Australia, you can receive the unemployment benefit as a student. It just has a different name. In New Zealand, there's an incredibly restrictive test about student allowances. And so a lot of people end up just using student loans. I know I did. And in that context, university students are treated very differently in New Zealand than Australia when it comes to the income support system, which is a way of cutting costs in New Zealand that some may see as unfair. Now, when it comes to cutting costs, the big way that this happens is through mutual obligations. Mutual obligations say, we expect you to do something while we're giving you this money. We might expect you to use a card rather than receive the money so that we know what you're buying from a supermarket. And it's very popular in Australia when it comes to benefit payments. It might also say you have to apply for 15 jobs a week, which would be quite crazy. It might also say you're expected to do certain training courses for Excel and the such, because it ticks certain boxes and they feel like they're getting you to do something to build up your skills and build up your human capital. Now, such mutual obligations do help to restrict costs by making sure that it's people genuinely looking for work who are receiving the benefit. But such costs reduce take-up in a way that sometimes excludes people who genuinely could turn around and have a fair claim for their unemployment benefit. So you could have a situation where you're being asked to do 15 applications for jobs every week, but you might work in a very specific job and might take a long time in industry, a long time to put together your CV, and you might have trouble using a computer. It's an old computer. In that situation, it's very costly for you to do it, and you might feel compelled to turn around and just not receive the benefit because of the amount of hassle. The amount it's making your job applications weaker than they were before, because you have to waste so much time applying for 14 extra jobs that you don't actually have an interest in going out and working in. In that instance, such costs, such punitive costs, can reduce take-up in ways where people that we meant to include get excluded. So we have to be very careful with how these things work and unintended consequences around them. Now, this gives us our idea of the iron triangle, and you have a whole bunch of really smart people in places like MSD, Treasury, and the Inland Revenue, right? I've worked with a lot of these people, and they're amazing, and they're thinking about these issues. They care about them a lot. They're trying to make sure how they all fit together and give really good advice on the trade-offs associated with each one, and where it looks like some people are facing harm or not harm. So this concept, this construct we're looking at, is very important for understanding how genuine policy is made. But to think about that, we also need an idea of what is the purpose. So we've got a purpose right here in the iron triangle, right? We want to provide income for those who are out of work, where there's other payments who help those who are not in the workforce. But we want to minimize the distortions in the incentive to work. Now, work search here is part of a feature of the program because it's minimizing costs. But because it might turn around and create perverse behavior by people, forcing them to apply for too many jobs when they don't mean to, rush into work when they could find a better job if they just waited a little while, if we weren't pressuring them, that might make it a bug. That might be something that makes our decision to target, make the system fall apart in terms of what it's intended to do, which is minimizing the distortion and incentives to work in the right sort of job, utilizing the skills that you have. Now, there's other purposes that relate to these sorts of things and can give us more context around it. So the unemployment benefit gives people a chance to search for work and find the right type of job, what we call the right match. It provides an automatic fiscal stabilizer when the economy slows. We know that when the economy slows, a lot of people find themselves out of work through no fault of their own. And by giving them this payment, we're both supporting them in what seems like a fair way, and we're preventing the downswing in the economy by supporting aggregate demand. Finally, It can give workers greater power to negotiate pay increases. So I believe you've gone through monopsonies in the labour market. And in this instance, such market power might turn around and not reduce employment, but allow some of the surplus in production to go back to workers instead through higher wages. If we increase the reservation income, I should say, available to people in that situation. Now, the thing economists often do here is they say the unemployment benefit is just about the minimum income for those looking for work and reducing distortions in the incentive to work, while other purposes require other policies. Now, I think that's a relatively strong argument, but these policies will interact with each other, and we should be clear about how an unemployment benefit affects these things. Furthermore, look at all three of those. They all relate to the labour market still. They all relate to the decision about how to go out and find work and the reward for finding that work, and therefore how we would think about it in what we'd call an insurance sense. So if we think there's an insurance motive to the unemployment benefit, then those three elements become very important. Now let's just have a look over New Zealand to make sure we understand what goes on here. So job seeker support is the payment that goes to people who are unemployed. There's a related part of job seeker support, there's for people with health conditions as well, but we won't focus on that here. It's a non-contributory payment, which means that what you paid doesn't depend on the tax you paid in the past, and also you're not expected to pay levies in order to receive this payment. It just happens. Even if you've never contributed tax, you can receive the unemployment benefit if you meet the criteria. You're paid a flat rate. It doesn't depend on past income, so someone who was on $100,000 in the past is not going to receive more than someone that's currently on $30,000. That has a certain fairness to it, but at the same time, if someone with a high income has higher costs at the moment, they might end up with a lot of hardship. And there can be a debate there on whether that's right or wrong, and I'll just leave it at that. It is pay-as-you-go, which means it's funded by current taxes. The government determines how it's funded by deciding to borrow or to save itself, and that is a pay-as-you-go system. This differs from a system where you would build up a stock of savings as a government that just sits there, which funds the payment as it goes forward. It is a means-tested system. As we've said before, this means we will look at the assets of the family and we will look at the income of the family to determine whether someone can receive it. And it's for unemployment, which means there's going to be work testing. It's conditional on the idea that you've lost a job and you're looking for another job. And depending on how you left that prior job, you might stand down for different periods of time. Now we've got a bunch of graphs here. The first one I think is very important. On the left, you have the number of people that are unemployed according to the Household Labour Force Survey, weighted up to the entire population. On the right, you have the number of work-ready job seeker recipients. People often say these numbers are quite close, and because work-ready recipients are higher, there must be some people gaming the system. You'll have some mutton heads saying that. However, you're going to get a situation where people are not reporting that they're unemployed because they're embarrassed, but they genuinely are unemployed, or they don't see themselves as unemployed, or the unemployed definition happens to have missed that they were currently on a bit of a holiday or some such. That distinction leads to this huge group of people who receive the benefit but are not unemployed. In the middle, you have people who are unemployed and receive the benefit, and on the left, you have people reporting that they are unemployed while not receiving it. So as you can see, even though the overall numbers look similar, the crossover between the number of people receiving the benefit who are unemployed and the people receiving the benefit and the people not receiving the benefit is quite small. We actually only have 40,000 people that are both unemployed and receiving job-ready assistance. We have a whole lot of people not employed receiving that payment and a whole lot of people employed not receiving it. Within that context, the dynamics of the two can be quite different, and the conditions match whatever has been imposed on work testing and the such at the moment. So looking at the unemployment rate and looking at these work-ready numbers can tell us very different stories about what's actually going on. Now, what are some of the differences? The HLFS unemployed includes people who are in a family where there is still someone earning money. So you're going to get a bunch of people who are unemployed and are not eligible. Now, what about on the other side, people who are eligible but are not unemployed? That's because the unemployment definition will say, have you looked for a job this week? Or will you take a job if it was offered to you at a current wage? And people will say no. They might say no because they just had a 1 week break from looking for jobs. They were looking the week before. They might say no because they're embarrassed on the phone to say they're unemployed and would like to pretend they're not. These things are quite common. But there is a work testing criteria that is keeping these people in the system. They have to keep following up on it and doing it. It's not that they're abusing the system per se. It's that they're meeting conditions that are different to the definition of the unemployment rate in the statistics. Now, what about the benefit level? So if you've been out of work for 6 months, in New Zealand or in Australia, you receive quite a low what's called a replacement rate. So this is comparing the amount you receive relative to 67% of the average income in each country. New Zealand and Australia are below the OECD average, which means that people are receiving less unemployment benefit in these countries relative to the income they could have been earning. When in countries like Luxembourg, Korea, Spain, Sweden, it's all more. Now, what about after 5 years in the long term? Well, New Zealand and Australia don't reduce the payments they provide. You get the same amount no matter how long you've been on the unemployment benefit. The rest of the world doesn't do that. A lot of them will cut you off, or they'll sharply reduce the rate you receive. As a result, Australia and New Zealand go above the OECD average, while a lot of other countries that you previously saw above, such as Korea, are now below it. So as you can see, New Zealand has a system where the replacement rate does not change depending on how long you've been out of work. And it's low when you first become unemployed, but then it's quite high compared to other countries in the long term. So looking through this, you might feel like there's an issue with that, or you might think that's a really fair way of doing things. What are the two arguments? The first one is, when someone is first out of work, they need time to search for a job, so support them. If they've been out of work for a long time, maybe they need some tough love to force them back in. That's the attitude around the rest of the world. The New Zealand and Australia attitude is, if you're unemployed, it doesn't matter how long it is, this is a shared experience, and we will treat you the same, irrespective of if it's been a month or if it's been 5 years. Depending on which judgment you believe, different systems might be preferable. As economists, we just want to define what the trade-offs are from choosing those different things. Further comparisons can be found here, and as well as some EMTRs. Now, I'd quite like to show you some EMTRs now. I'm just going to pull up another screen to do that. And with unemployment done, we're ready to go across and start thinking about the optimal benefit. Now, the optimal benefit isn't just about the payment, how large the payment should be, but also how the payment is funded. And how we're going to think about that conceptually as economists will start to make a lot more sense with how the two fit together in terms of how we will think about this redistributing in certain ways. Now, we're going to define the optimal benefit along 3 margins. So the iron triangle that we put down as a useful policy framework for considering trade-offs. That's great. As economists, we want to go a step further, and we really want to think about the mechanisms in terms of the behavior of individuals and how these correspond to markets and then aggregate up. Therefore, we can think about private insurance and related frictions in labor markets. We can think about equity considerations or fairness considerations. And we can think about, when it comes to the aggregation, macroeconomic effects that come out of the changes that are happening and how they may correspond to types of coordination failures. Now let's dig into the first one, the private insurance argument. In the more modern literature on unemployment benefits and unemployment insurance, which is very commonly how unemployment assistance is given overseas to a lot of the population, with a menial unemployment assistance, unemployment benefit type payment. With that concept, how do we think about individual choices and how the individual is viewing the unemployment benefit? So when we look at this, we're not going to start with the idea that reduced labor supply is clearly bad. The idea that labor supply being lower is clearly bad comes from the idea that there's perfect competition and people are supplying their labor efficiently and just are turning around and are supplying less than what would be the efficient amount. We know that although that framework can be useful and gets bagged a bit too much, there is actually underlying reasons why this doesn't happen. Search and matching models have shown us that you can have many different people on both sides of the market, but because of information issues and because of frictions in the labor market, that doesn't mean that you're necessarily getting an efficient allocation of both the time and job and the type of job that people might go into. So within this context where there's information, it's natural to think that there'll need to be some form of insurance. Now, when we have insurance, there's going to be three important things that help us conceptualize the trade-offs associated with the establishment of an unemployment benefit as a proxy for a public insurance market for people who get made unemployed prior to unemployment. So you have a situation where people are paying taxes or they're paying a levy, and that levy funds an unemployment benefit that they'd receive if they end up in a bad state of the world, if they end up unemployed. Now, knowing that, people may change their behavior and they might decide to work less. That typical type of labor supply response that we described before is moral hazard associated with the pooling of risk. So you've got risk pooled, and people take advantage of that by turning around and working less or shirking from their job, leading to a situation where it's more likely they get fired, and then they're not too worried about it because it's insured. However, that can lead to further issues if we have an underlying private insurance market that has adverse selection. So if there's a private insurance market and there's adverse selection, that can lead to a situation where there are bad claimants who will turn around and the insurer won't be able to tell that they're actually bad, that they're likely to claim on the benefit more often than they'll pay. And because of that, they'll select in while people who are good, who don't expect to be made unemployed, do not. That selection in leads to a situation where the private market unwinds. And for that reason, you may well want a public compulsory unemployment type option, unemployment insurance, that solves that adverse selection issue. So given the moral hazard exists, that creates an efficiency cost. But dealing with the adverse selection means that private insurance that's not there is being provided due to the government taking on that role. So you have a clearly defined market failure that's being solved by government action, and moral hazard is the potential efficiency cost. Now that's a good framework. That makes sense for why we might have an unemployment insurance system. Now, how can we think about this further? Well, there are actually other private options that aren't to do with, going out and getting a direct insurance contract. You can get support from your family. You can save money while you're working. These types of things give you that insurance anyway. So, what is the role for government there? Well, we may well have liquidity-constrained individuals. Imagine that you're young, which many of you are. Well, if you get into a job soon and then lose it, you haven't had the chance to build up your savings. Furthermore, if you're in your 50s and you've been building up savings because you fear unemployment risk, you will have oversaved as a group of people if each of you is individually insuring that risk by saving. If there's some way you could pool that risk by working together and insuring, there wouldn't be a need to save as much. And within that construct, we have this idea that there are liquidity constraints that people face. They can't borrow based on future income. They can't pool risk amongst each other. And given that, there is a clear benefit from offering public insurance, the cost being moral hazard. So when we come to this idea of self-insurance versus social insurance, we're thinking about the benefits of dealing with liquidity constraints and the lack of pooling of risk versus the cost of moral hazard. This is called the Bailey-Chitty framework. The Bailey-Chitty framework, which we're going to go through in a lot more detail, compares the social cost associated with moral hazard to the social benefit associated with people being able to break down these liquidity constraints. And then it says that there is some role for an optimal benefit from that. Another way of conceptualizing this idea is its redistribution over a lifetime. So, someone says to themselves that if they're going to be in a state of the world where they're unemployed, they want to redistribute some of their income to there, and they can do so through this type of scheme where they might not have otherwise had the chance due to liquidity constraints and failure of private insurance markets. So that's quite a natural argument, and it leads us clearly to certain ways we measure things, but it misses something, doesn't it? Equity. The whole point of having this form of a type of minimum income amongst people who are working is that we're redistributing between people. People who do not have an endowment, people who do not get the opportunities to generate income, well, we want to make sure that we can redistribute to them as a society. Now, maybe we do, maybe we don't, but insofar as that is how we feel, part of how we redistribute is not just by taxing people that have higher income, it's by providing income to people with lower incomes from that taxation. So the unemployment benefit system will also do that. This equity role is above the insurance role. It's something that happens in addition to, and in that way, when we talk about preventing poverty, as we did earlier, it was very much on these equity grounds that we would have some equity view. That insurance argument we made was actually quite a separate one, as it was focusing on the same person and market failures that occurred for them. Now, as you can see, there are multiple ways that we can measure poverty here along different lines, and all of these types of ways can be affected by how you turn around and think about this redistribution. Now, redistribution will change the distribution of income, and it will ensure that people that have restricted opportunities can share in some of the social gains of what occurs. So we're allowed to have a view that there's an equitable reason for why an unemployment benefit will be a certain level, without any reference to this insurance type argument. The insurance argument is around the efficiency. There is some potential for a missing market to be dealt with through an unemployment and benefit system. And economists love that stuff because it sounds a bit like it's a free lunch, etc., etc. But equity is where a lot of the jam is. This is where people actually care quite deeply about either there not being much redistribution or there being a lot, because of some underlying view about what is fair and what opportunities people have. Now, understanding what's going on with technological change, with monopsony in the labour market, with all sorts of different fairness-related issues that provide people opportunity, wealth inequality, regional disparities, these things feed into what we might see as a fair minimum income and fair types of policies. And that still affects the level of the payment beyond the Bailey-Chitty result we're talking about. Now, the final interesting one that comes up is the idea that there's actually interdependence. When we say that there's a labour market and when we say there's an income distribution, well, these things don't just exist in isolation. They're fairly large, the labour market's a fairly large market, and the generation of income is the aggregation of all markets. In that way, there's an interdependence between individuals' actions that is generating what is happening. So we can get a whole series of different issues that come up as relevant and affected by the structure of how we will set an unemployment policy. So we've already mentioned the idea of pooling of risk, but we can move that out a bit more and notice that it affects aggregate savings. If risk is pooled, then you don't need to save as much, and as a result, aggregate savings behavior will decline. Now, this could be a positive thing because it's more efficient savings, but if we think there's other market failures leading to insufficient savings and things such as a lack of capital depth in the economy, then turning around and allowing more pooling of risk can be problematic. So the way these policies tie into each other can be important. Labour market power is an important issue because the higher the reservation income, the more power someone has to demand a higher wage. Imagine the unemployment benefit was very, very high, and then people were being asked to do a job that was really disgusting. It involved going through a swamp and pulling out dead bodies. That was off the top of my head something that doesn't sound nice at all. They would have people who have no other opportunity would have an opportunity due to the fact the unemployment benefit is higher, and so they would be able to demand a higher wage when doing that type of job. Now, if that wage means that people don't do the job, that suggests that not much value was being generated doing that job anyway. So when we start thinking over everything and when we have these issues of market power, sometimes allowing a business to fail or a type of activity to fail isn't a bad thing. We shouldn't romanticize that. Another issue we get is a congestion externality in labour markets. Congestion externalities are exactly what they sound like. Imagine that there is a bunch of people driving on the Auckland Harbour Bridge, and then someone else comes on and slows everyone behind them down. They're driving a bit slow, or they've just joined traffic in general. The fact that they're slowing everyone down by joining means that their decision to drive on that road has delayed everyone else's time. And people can try to get around that by finding a different way in, taking the ferry instead, yada yada. But these all are decisions that have a cost. They're not what people would have chosen in the absence of that externality. And so this can lead to coordination issues where you would like people to spread out their activity. In the case of unemployment, often when you have a big recession, there's a lot of people looking for very few jobs, all at the same time. If people could feel comfortable spreading that out a bit, it would reduce the congestion externality and it might improve how people match with jobs. Again, search and matching theory comes in here to give us additional insights. A further spillover is in terms of automatic stabilizers. We know that monetary policy is currently at the zero lower bound, and it can be hard for monetary authorities to stabilize the economy. First, there was high unemployment for a persistent period of time, and now there's quite substantially high inflation. So it is difficult for monetary authorities to know what to do. If fiscal policy is more counter-cyclical, then that helps do some of the job for them. And we don't have to worry about it being discretionary and governments having to remove and add things. If it's happening automatically, then that helps. Finally, we have an idea of broader social benefits, such as reduced crime, improved health, improved developmental outcomes, if people are able to have sufficient material needs. Now, what I want to note here is these spillovers are not always positive things, even though they've been framed this way. These social benefits don't necessarily happen, and it might be a bit of assumption they do. The labour market power issue comes with the idea that we're now giving individuals more power and more incentive to undertake quite moral hazard related behaviour. As a result, there can be inefficiencies from that. The pooling of risk, we've already noted one of the big issues, that if there's already insufficient savings, this would exacerbate it. The congestion externality itself isn't necessarily clear. It's not necessarily going to happen that way, and if people end up searching too long, it becomes another form of moral hazard in the labour market, where people just stay out of jobs because why not? They're going to go on holiday. And we might say there's a behavioural bias where people might be too attracted to a certain job and go in, but there similarly could be a behavioural bias where people, given the opportunity to stay away from work, just keep staying away from it and end up losing their human capital. All these things interplay with each other, and these arguments are as old as time. You can go back 150 years and people were discussing the same things. We have new fancy models that allow us to think about a margin, but the interplay between them all is complicated, and a lot of the modern work is about trying to understand these margins, trying to measure them and trying to figure out how they play out, what they tell us about what an optimal benefit would be, an optimal structure of unemployment support, and how it relates to these different margins of insurance, equity, and macroeconomic spillovers and effects that we've just discussed. Now, for this, we have a series of assignment questions that are things that, if this topic interests you, you could do a presentation on. Now, I've noted them here, and I've got readings noted as well, but I'm going to save discussing them and discussing the reading to when we meet up in person. So thank you all very much for this fun session. The next session will be based on looking at those margins of analysis in detail, showing what the Bailey-Chitty model looks like, showing how we measure equity. We'll sit down and we'll do that and figure out measurement things, but with this framework, you're now in a good space to start thinking about how to answer one of these three questions. Thank you all, and I will see you immediately after this.